The wind at Dry Mesa never fully stops. It runs down off the north ridges before dawn, cold and dry and steady, and by mid-morning it has learned to lie, to slack off in the low ground and sprint through the saddles, to push a bullet one way at 600 yards and the other way at 9. I had spent 11 years learning that wind. I could read it in the way the cheatgrass leaned and the way the mirage boiled off the berms, and I had killed men at distances that wind said were impossible, because I had stopped listening to what the wind said and started listening to what it did. That was the difference. I used to tell my students, anybody can hear the wind. A shooter watches it. So when the truck came up the access road that first morning, trailing a rooster tail of pale dust, and the door opened and a kid climbed down, I will tell you exactly what I thought, because I want you to understand how wrong a certain man can be while feeling entirely sure. I thought, somebody made a mistake. She was small. Not fragile, there is a difference, and I would learn it, but small in the way that makes you do the math on how much rifle she could hold steady, and I did that math in about a second and a half and came up short. She had a duffel over one shoulder and a rifle case in the other hand, and she carried the case the way you carry something you own rather than something you were issued, low and easy, the weight already accounted for in her stride. Dark hair pulled back tight. A face that hadn't finished deciding what it would look like at 30. She squinted up at the shelter where we stood, 6 of us, cadre, the best long gun men the community could spare for a 4-week package. And she didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't do any of the things a 19-year-old does when she wants older men to like her. She just looked at the range behind us, the flags out at 400 and 800 and past the 1200 line where the steel sat small as thumbnails, and I watched her read it. I didn't know yet that she was reading it. I thought she was gawking. "Tell me that's the ammo resupply," said Petty Officer Cody Trell at my elbow. Trell was 26 and thought he was funny, and about a third of the time he was. "That," I said, "is somebody's clerical error." Her orders said what her orders said. Petty Officer 3rd Class E. Vance, attached to the cadre for the duration of the precision package. 3rd Class. 19 years old, according to the date of birth I'd glanced at and dismissed. In the community, you did not send a 19-year-old 3rd class to a cadre of senior snipers unless you meant it as a joke or a favor, and I couldn't think whose favor she'd be, so I settled on joke and got comfortable there. I want to be honest about the shape of my certainty because the certainty is the whole story. It was not cruelty. I have known cruel men on the line and I was not one of them. It was worse than cruelty in a way because cruelty at least knows it is doing something. Mine was the certainty of a man who had earned what he knew and therefore trusted it past the point where trust is wise. I looked at her and I did not see a person. I saw a category, kid, mascot, somebody up the chain checking a box. And once I had filed her under that heading, everything she did afterward for the better part of a week, I read as confirmation, because that is what certainty does. It doesn't look, it sorts. She walked up under the shelter and set her case down flat, not leaning it against the bench, and she came to something like attention in front of me and she said, "Senior Chief, Vance, reporting for the package," level voice. No apology in it and no bravado either. Just the fact of herself, delivered and set down like the case. "You know what we do out here, Vance," I said. "Long guns, Senior Chief. Cold bore, unknown distance, wind. Your package grades a shooter across 400 to 1250, movers on the back half." She'd read the syllabus. Fine, anybody could read a syllabus. "You shot before." "Yes, Senior Chief." "Where?" A small pause. Not hesitation. I'd learned to tell her hesitations from her decisions, and this was a decision. "Around," she said. The men laughed low, the way a pack laughs when the leader hasn't decided yet whether a thing is funny. "Around." I let it sit. "Around," I repeated. "Well, we'll find out what around taught you." I nodded at the far end of the line, the point nobody wanted, the one that sat lowest in the ground so the mirage came off the 200 berm and washed your whole sight picture into soup by 9 in the morning, the point where the wind did its worst lying. "Point 6 is yours. Get your gear squared." We start cold bore in 40. I seen your chief. She picked up her case and walked down to point 6 and didn't say a word about it being the worst point, which of course she knew it was, because she'd read the range the same way I had in that first second off the truck, and she had already decided she would outshoot us from the worst point rather than argue for a better one. I didn't understand that yet. I thought she just didn't know any better. I keep coming back to that. How many of her decisions I read as ignorance in those first days, because ignorance was the only thing my category had room for. Trell watched her go. $20 says she can't get around on the 1200 steel all week. I don't take a man's money for free, I said, and I meant it as the cruelest thing I'd said yet, and every man under that shelter grinned, and downrange the girl knelt at point 6 and began, with a care I mistook for slowness, to lay out her rifle. That rifle should have told me. I've thought about it since, how much a man can miss when he's already decided what he's looking at. Her case opened flat and clean, foam cut to the tool, and the rifle that came out of it was not an issue gun. It was a bolt gun she'd clearly built or had built to her, the stock set to her length of pull, the optic mounted with the turrets worn bright at the edges from a great many corrections dialed and dialed back. A shooter's rifle. A rifle with a lot of rounds through it. And her data book, she set a data book down on the bench, a real one, fat and soft-cornered and full, the kind a man fills over years, not the thin new one they issue you. If I had walked down to point 6 and opened that book, I would have known everything by the second morning. I didn't walk down. I stood under the shelter with my coffee and my certainty, and I let a 19-year-old carry the worst point on my range, and I called it fair because I'd have made any new shooter earn it, and I told myself the age had nothing to do with it, and that was the first lie, and it was to myself. The Halloran Reach ran 2,000 yards up a shallow bowl of high desert, the firing line at 5,200 feet, where the air was thin enough to flatten your trajectory, and cold enough at dawn to stiffen your fingers on the bolt. Steel hung at every 100 from 4 to 12, and past that, out where the bowl narrowed and the far ridge threw the wind into knots, sat the unknown distance array and the movers on their rails, targets that ran a track at speeds you had to lead, at distances you had to range by eye and mill, no laser allowed, the way it is when it counts. It was the finest long-range facility I'd ever run a package on, and I was proud of it the way you're proud of a thing you've made yours, and I had it in my head that the Reach would humble the girl by Thursday and send her back up the road, and everyone would have a story and no harm done. That was the plan I didn't know I'd made. The Reach had other ideas, and so, it turned out, did she. We started cold bore at 0800. Cold bore is the truest test a rifle shooter faces and the one the range can't give back to you twice a day. The first round out of a clean, cold barrel, the shot you get in the real world, the one with no warmers before it and no second chance behind it. Everything a sniper is comes down to whether he can put that first cold round where it has to go, once cold, with the wind lying to him. My cadre could do it. That was the point of my cadre. And I had them line up, all 6 of the students plus the girl, at their points, on the 800 steel to start. An honest distance, wind quartering maybe 8 to 12, and building, mirage just starting to run. 1 round cold bore 800, I called down the line. Your dope, your wind, your call, fire when you own it. I walked the line behind them with my spotting scope and I watched my students settle in, good men, methodical, and one by one they broke their shots and the steel rang or it didn't. Trell rang it, low left, a hit but a lazy one. Okafor rang it clean center. Devlin missed right, cursed, chambered his warmer. 2 hits, 1 miss, and me still walking. And I came at last to point 6, and I stopped behind the girl to watch her fail. She was already down behind the rifle, and here is the first thing I saw that I could not sort into my category, though I tried. She was not rushing. Every other shooter on that line, good as they were, carried a little hurry in them that first cold morning, the small performance you put on when the boss is walking the line, the settle, the breath, the break, done at the tempo of a man who knows he's being watched. She had none of it. She lay behind that rifle like she had all the time God ever made. Her eye was in the glass and her body was still, so still that the only thing moving on her was the slow rise and fall of her back under the plate carrier, and even that was disappearing as she came down through her breathing. She wasn't looking at the steel. I could tell by the angle of her head that she was reading the flags, the near one and the middle one and the far one by the berm, and the mirage running between, and she was doing arithmetic behind her eyes that I recognized because I did it too. The mental sum of wind and drop and the little spin the bullet carries, all of it collapsing into a number, and then the number becoming a turn of the turret and a hold in the glass. She dialed. I heard the clicks, soft, precise, and then no more clicks. She wasn't fidgeting the turret the way a nervous shooter does, dialing and second-guessing and dialing back. One correction. Owned. And then the stillness went total, that particular stillness that a shooter learns to recognize in another shooter. The held moment right before, when the whole person has narrowed down to the pad of one finger, and I found that I had stopped breathing too, standing behind her, which annoyed me, and then she broke the shot. The rifle barely moved. Good position, good recoil management, the muzzle coming back down on target almost before the report finished rolling out across the bowl. And a half-second later, out at 800 yards, the steel rang, not the lazy off-center clang of a hit that got lucky finding the plate, but the flat, hard center punch note, the one you feel in your teeth, dead in the middle of the gong. Cold bore first round, center. Trell 2 points down said, huh, under his breath. I said nothing. I told myself it was a good hit and that a good hit at 800 in that wind was possible for any competent shooter on a lucky morning, and I filed the word lucky where I needed it, and I moved on down the line and finished my walk. But something had happened in my chest that I didn't have a category for, a small cold drop, the feeling you get when a fact knocks on the door of a thing you were sure of. I ignored it. That was still Monday. I had a whole week to be right, and I intended to use it. We ran cold bore twice more that morning at longer distances, and then the wind came up hard the way it does at dry mesa when the sun gets high, 15 gusting 20, quartering and switching, the kind of wind that turns a range day into a lesson in humility, and I was glad of it because I thought it would finally sort her. It sorted my students. Good men, all of them, and the far steel started eating their rounds, Mrs. Lowe and Mrs. Wide, the wind reaching out at 1,000 yards and just taking the bullet somewhere the shooter hadn't sent it. Devlin, who was my best student and not far off cadre himself, put 3 straight into the dirt off the 1200 plate and came off his rifle red-faced. That was the wind doing what the wind does. I didn't hold it against them. I held it against her, though, or I expected the wind to do to her what mercy wouldn't let me. I stood behind .6 for the 1200 string, and I waited for the desert to send the child home. She read the wind for a long time before that string, longer than the others. She lay behind the rifle, and she watched the flags cycle through their lies, the near flag and the far flag disagreeing the way they do when the wind is switching in the bowl, and I watched her not shoot through 2 gusts that any of my students would have taken because the clock in their heads told them to. She was waiting for the wind to tell the truth. And when it did, when the flags briefly agreed and the mirage laid over flat and running the same direction top to bottom, she had already dialed for it, and she broke the shot into that window, and the 1200 steel, the far plate, the one Trell had bet me she couldn't touch all week, rang center on the first cold pass of the morning. Trell didn't say huh that time. Nobody said anything. My whole cadre had stopped their own shooting to watch the kid on .6 ring the far steel in a wind that had just beaten 3 of them off it, and I stood there with the cold drop in my chest getting colder, and I did the only thing a certain man can do when the facts start knocking. I got angrier at the facts. Beginner's luck runs out, I said, loud enough for the line. Let's see it twice. She rang it twice. Then a third time, and by the third the wind had built again and switched, and she read the switch and held off for it, held off, Didn't dial, just moved her aiming point into the wind the exact amount the new gust demanded. A shooter's fast correction. The kind you only make when the arithmetic is so deep in you it isn't arithmetic anymore. And rang it a third time. Center, in a wind that by then had my best man packing his brass in disgust. I should tell you what I did with that because it's the part I'm least proud of and the part that matters most. I did not walk down to point 6 and shake her hand. I did not open her data book. A better man, a man less sure, would have known by Monday noon that something rare had come up the access road in that dust and would have had the humility to go and see it. I wasn't that man yet. I took her cold bore center hits and her wind reads and her data book fat with years, and I fed all of it into the one story my certainty could still tell, that she was a range shooter, a paper puncher. A kid who'd grown up on some square range with a coach and a flat wind and a lot of rounds, and who could ring steel all day on a known distance line where the numbers were painted on the berms, but who would come apart the moment the range stopped being a game and started being what we actually did out here. Unknown distance. Movers. No painted numbers. The real thing. She'd never seen the real thing, I told myself. Nobody her age had. And on Thursday, when we ran the unknown distance cold bore stage, the stage that separated shooters from snipers, the desert would finally tell her the truth I couldn't make myself say. I held that story all through Monday and into the week, and it held me. And the whole time the girl at point 6 kept ringing steel and filling her data book and saying, "I, senior chief," and not one word more, and never once, not once in all of it, did she look at me like she needed me to believe her. That should have told me something too. The ones who need you to believe them are usually the ones still proving it to themselves. She wasn't proving anything. She already knew what she was. She was just waiting, with a patience I mistook for meekness, for the rest of us to catch up. Tuesday the wind came in from the east, which at dry mesa is the mean wind, the one that comes over the low ground first so your flags lie to you by degrees, agreeing at the muzzle and disagreeing out where it matters. I ran the cadre through mid-range strings all morning, 4 to 800, and I put the girl back on point 6, and I watched her out of the corner of my certainty and pretended I wasn't. I want to tell you about my own name on that line because it belongs in this. I was Senior Chief Reuben Marsh, and out in the community, among the men who did what I did, that name meant something. I had 31 confirmed, and a good many more that never got confirmed because of where they happened, and I had made a shot in a valley I am not allowed to name that men still talked about, a shot the wind said couldn't be made, and I had made it cold first round, because I had stopped listening to what the wind said. I tell you this not to boast. I've done my boasting and I'm ashamed of most of it, but so you understand what was at stake for me under that shelter. I was not a man who could be outshot by a child without something breaking. My whole life was built on being the best rifle in any bowl I walked into, and here was this 19-year-old on the worst point on my range, quietly ringing steel I'd watched better men miss, and every hit she made put a small crack in the load-bearing wall of who I was. That's why I fought it so hard. It wasn't about her. It was about the wall. Devlin came and stood by me Tuesday afternoon, while she was running an 800 string. And Devlin was the only one of them who'd stopped laughing. "Senior Chief," he said low, "you watching her hold-offs?" "I'm watching." She held off 2 mils into that last switch. Didn't dial, just moved and broke. I couldn't have called that switch that fast. "You're learning," I said. "That's what the package is for." I'm saying she's already learned it. He wasn't a man who pushed Devlin, but he pushed then, gentle, the way a good subordinate tells his boss something the boss doesn't want to hear. "Where'd she come up?" "Around," she says. "Around where?" A kid doesn't read a switching bowl like that off around. "You want to go open her data book, Devlin, go open it," I said, and it came out harder than I meant. And Devlin looked at me a second the way you look at a man who's just told you more about himself than he knew he was telling. And then he said, "I, Senior Chief," and went back to his point. He didn't open her book, but he'd have been right to, and we both knew it, and the knowing sat between us the rest of the day. That was the thing about my certainty by Tuesday. It had stopped being comfortable. Monday it had been a warm thing I wore. By Tuesday afternoon it had started to itch, because the facts were piling up against it faster than I could sort them, and a man can only call a thing luck so many times before the word wears through. Cold bore center at 1200 in that wind is not luck once. It is certainly not luck 3 times. And it is a special kind of not luck when the shooter waits out the bad wind and takes only the true window every single time, because luck doesn't have that kind of patience. Only skill has that patience. Skill and something underneath skill, a discipline that I was beginning to recognize because I had spent my life building it in myself, and I knew what it looked like from the inside, and I was watching it operate at point 6 in a body a third my age. Wednesday the wind gave us its worst yet, and Wednesday is when the wall started to come down, and it came down over one shot I will remember on my deathbed. We were running a 900 cold bore string mid-morning when the bowl did the thing the Reach is famous for, a full reversal. The wind swinging almost 180 degrees over about 90 seconds as a cell moved through up on the ridge, so that a shooter who dialed for a left-to-right wind suddenly had a right-to-left wind of nearly equal value, and if he didn't catch it he'd throw his round nearly 4 feet off at 900 yards and never know why. I caught it. I'd seen it 1,000 times. I called it down the line, winds revering, hold your fire, let it settle. And my good disciplined students came off their triggers and waited, all of them, all 6. The girl didn't come off her trigger, she stayed down in the glass. And I opened my mouth to call her off, to tell the kid to wait like the grown-ups, and before the words came out she broke the shot into the middle of the reversal. Into the exact moment the wind passed through zero on its way from one direction to the other, the half-second dead calm hinge that exists in the middle of every full reversal, and that maybe one shooter in 100 even knows is there, and that maybe 1 in 1,000 can catch by eye and put a cold round through. And the 900 steel rang center, in no wind, because she had known, the way I knew things in the body below the arithmetic, that the reversal had to pass through zero, and she had waited not for the wind to settle but for that single hinge of stillness inside the chaos, and she had owned it. I have run a lot of men across a lot of lines. I had never seen anyone catch the hinge of a reversal on a cold first round. I'm not sure I could have done it. I stood behind point 6 and I felt the wall go, not all at once, but the load-bearing crack of it, the sound a certainty makes when it finally admits it was never as solid as the man leaning on it. "Vance," I said, my voice didn't come out the way I meant it to. "That shot, you called the zero in the reversal." She came up out of the glass and looked back at me, and there was nothing in her face that gloated, nothing that said finally, old man, just that level attention. "The reversal has to cross zero to change sides, Senior Chief," she said, like she was telling me something obvious that I'd surely known longer than she'd been alive, offering it to me instead of holding it over me. "Faster to shoot the zero than to wait out the whole switch, if you can see it. If you can see it." She said it plainly, no edge on it, and it was the most humbling sentence anyone had spoken to me in a decade, because the whole art of what I did was in those 5 words, and a 19-year-old had just handed them to me across the worst point on my range like she was passing me a tool I'd set down. I didn't say anything wise back. I want to tell you I did, but I didn't. I said, "Carry on," and I walked back up the line and I stood under the shelter, and for the first time all week I let myself do the thing I should have done Monday. I stopped sorting her and started looking at her. And once I was looking, really looking, the way you look at another shooter you're trying to learn from instead of a category you're trying to confirm, I saw all of it, everything I'd refused to see. The built rifle, the worn turrets, the fat data book, the stillness, the patience, the hold-offs, the wind reads, the way she took only the true windows, the way she never once needed me to believe her. I saw a shooter, a real one, maybe a great one, and I felt the specific shame of a man who realizes he has spent 3 days being exactly the fool he'd have warned a young man never to be. But I was still Reuben Marsh, and the wall was cracked, not down, and I had one story left, and Thursday would test it. Thursday was the unknown distance cold bore stage, the real thing, and some stubborn last redoubt of my certainty told me that ringing known steel, however beautifully, was still not the same as the discipline we actually deployed. The ranging, the movers, the first cold round on a target whose distance was not painted anywhere, in a wind that lied. Range shooters, I told myself one last time, come apart when the numbers stop being given to them. Thursday would show me whether she was a range shooter or a sniper. Thursday showed me. It just didn't show me what I'd bet on. I need to tell you what the unknown distance cold bore stage was, because everything turns on it. It was the stage I'd built the whole package to climax on, the one that graded a shooter against the standard the cadre itself was held to. Here is how it ran. Each shooter came to the line cold, clean barrel, no fouling shots, no warmers, nothing. Downrange, across the far half of the bowl from about 600 yards out to past 12, sat a spread of steel at unknown distances. No numbers, some of it angled and hard to see against the broken ground, and beyond the static steel on their rails, the movers' targets that ran a track left to right and back at a walking man's pace. At distances you had to range by the mill lines in your own reticle and by nothing else. A shooter got one cold round on each target called in order by the cadre. He ranged it himself, read the wind himself, dialed or held himself, and broke one cold shot. Hit or miss logged next target, no lasers, no coaching, no second rounds. It was as close as a range can come to the thing itself, and it was scored hard, hit or miss, cold round only, and in 11 years of running it I had watched it humble men who thought they'd arrived. There was more riding on it than a grade, and this is the part I didn't know Thursday morning, though I know it now. The girl had not been sent to my cadre as a student. She'd been sent as a check. Somebody well up the chain, somebody who'd grown quietly worried that pre-deployment long-range packages across the community had been drifting soft, gratting themselves against themselves, passing men who rang known steel on flat mornings and calling it ready, had decided to find out whether the cadres could still shoot the standard cold against a shooter who indisputably could. And they had reached down into the precision rifle world, past rank, past age, past everything a proud senior chief would look at and dismiss, and they had found the best cold-bore unknown distance shooter they could lay hands on who wasn't already a cadre instructor, and they had attached her to me, on paper as a lowly third class, to see whether my line still shot to standard or only thought it did. She wasn't there to be graded by us. We were being graded by her. The worst point on the range, the laughter, the beginner's luck, I'd logged in my own hand. She had absorbed all of it for 4 days and written none of it down as grievance, because the grievance wasn't the assignment. The assignment was the cold bore stage, and she had been waiting for Thursday with the patience of someone who knew that the range, unlike men, does not care how old you are. We ran the cadre first. That was my doing. I put my students up before her, still telling myself she'd watch them succeed and lose her nerve, still spending certainty I no longer had. And my students shot well. This is important. They were good. Akafor ranged clean and rang 4 of his 6 static plates and 1 of his 2 movers, a strong showing cold. Devlin rang 5 of 6 static and both movers, the best run of my students, a genuinely excellent cold-bore stage that would have graded him ready anywhere in the community. I remember the relief on his face and the pride I felt, because they were mine and they'd shot to standard, and for a moment I let myself believe the standard was safe and the girl would merely be good. Then I shot, because I always shot the stage last among the cadre, to close it, to show the students what the top of the mountain looked like. And I will tell you plainly, I shot the best cold-bore stage of my life. I don't know if it was the pressure of the week or the crack in my wall or the girl standing quiet at point 6 waiting her turn, but something narrowed me down that morning the way I hadn't narrowed in years. I ranged every plate true. I read every wind. I rang all 6 static plates cold, first round, center or near it, and I took both movers, led them clean, broke the shots into the lead, rang them both, And when I came up off the rifle, the line was quiet, with the particular quiet of men who have just watched something rare. And Devlin said, "Senior Chief," in a voice with real awe in it, and I felt, God help me, vindicated. 8 for 8. A perfect cold-bore unknown distance stage. In 31 years, I'd shot it clean maybe 3 times. I'd shot it clean now, Thursday, in a lying east wind with everything watching. I turned around and I found the girl looking at me, and for the first time all week there was something new in her face. Not doubt, not intimidation, something closer to gladness, the specific gladness of a shooter who has finally, after 4 days of mascots and beginner's luck, been shown a real one. She just watched me shoot 8 for 8 cold, and she was glad because now it would mean something. She wasn't afraid of my perfect stage. She'd been waiting for it. A great shooter doesn't want to outshoot a weak field. She wants the strong one on the line, so the thing she's about to do can't be called luck by even the most stubborn man alive. I just handed her that, and she was grateful for it, and I didn't understand the look until she was down behind her rifle, and it was too late to be anything but a witness. "Vance," I said, "you've got the stage, same as the rest. Cold bore, unknown distance, 1 round per target, my call for order. Movers last." I paused. Some last mean flicker made me add, "No warmers, nobody gets a warmer." "Senior Chief," she said. "I've never wanted one." She built her position at point 6 the way she'd built everything all week, without hurry, and I came down off the shelter and stood behind her because I was done pretending I had anywhere better to be. The whole cadre drifted down with me. Nobody said it, but we all knew what we were about to watch, or thought we did. A good kid shoot a good stage and fall a plate or 2 short of my 8, and everyone could go home with the order of the world roughly intact, and me a little chastened and a lot impressed. That's the stage I thought I was watching begin. I keep telling you what I thought because the distance between what I thought and what happened is the whole measure of how wrong a sure man can be. "First target," I called. "Second plate from the left of the near cluster. Range it and send it." She found it in her glass. I watched her range it off the mill lines, the target's height against the stadia in her reticle, the arithmetic running behind her still face, height over mills times a constant, distance falling out of it, the way we do it when the laser isn't allowed and the real world doesn't hand you numbers. She read the wind off the flags and the mirage, and she didn't dial. She held. A hold at that distance in that wind is a harder, braver call than a dial, because a dial you can check on the turret and a hold lives only in your eye, and she held and broke the shot, and the plate rang center, cold, first round. "Hit," Devlin said, unnecessary because we'd all heard it. Next, the angled plate high right of the middle cluster, the one sitting into the shadow. That one was cruel. I'd set it there myself, angled away and into the broken ground where it hit against the shadow of a rock shelf, hard to even see clean, harder to range because the angle foreshortened it in the glass and threw off the mill height. 2 of my students had missed it clean. I had ranged it by knowing the ground, by having built the range, half memory and half mill. She had no memory of it. She had 4 days. She lay there and worked it. I saw her range it twice, checking her own number, the only shooter all week I'd seen check her range, not from doubt but from discipline, the discipline that says a hard target earns a second read, and she dialed for the angle, cosine and all, the little correction most shooters forget under pressure, and she broke the shot, and the hidden angled plate rang center. The one 2 of my men couldn't find. Cold. First round. I stopped calling the hits after that. We all did. The desert did the talking. She rang the third. She rang the fourth, a 1,200-yard plate at the far edge of the static array where the wind out of the narrowing bowl was doing 3 things at once, and she read all 3 and put a cold round center. She rang the fifth. She came to the sixth, the last static plate, the farthest and smallest, out past 1,200 where my own round had gone center low. A hit, but the least of my 8. The one plate on my whole clean stage I wasn't fully proud of, and she ranged it and read it and held for it and broke the shot, and it rang dead center, cleaner than mine had, and I heard myself let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. 6 static plates. 6 cold first-round center hits. She had matched my static string plate for plate, and on the 2 hardest targets on the range, the hidden angled plate and the far small one, she had shot them cleaner than I had. And now came the movers, and the movers were where I still, in some last animal corner of my pride, believed the week would right itself. Because a mover is the hardest cold shot there is. You have to range a moving target, read the wind, and solve the lead all at once, in the seconds the target is on the open track, and break one cold round into a place the target isn't yet but will be. My 2 movers had been the shots I was proudest of. Nobody her age had ever shot a mover in my package clean. Nobody her age, I was sure, had ever shot one at all. Movers, I said. First mover left rail, it'll run on my mark. 1 cold round, lead it true. She settled, and here I have to slow down, because what she did on that first mover is the thing I brought all the way home from Dry Mesa and have carried since. The thing I tell the young shooters now when they think talent is the point. She didn't watch the target. Not first. First she watched the track, the empty rail, before I ever gave the mark, and she was ranging the track itself, the spot where the target would run, so that when the mover appeared she wouldn't have to range and lead and read all at once against the clock. She'd already have the range. She'd already have the wind. All she'd have left to solve in the live seconds was the lead, and she'd bought herself that margin by reading the empty rail while the rest of us were still watching for the target. It was the single most professional thing I saw all week. It was what I did. It was what I'd spent a career learning to do, and she was doing it cold at 19, and I understood, finally and completely, standing behind her in the east wind, that I was not watching a talented kid. I was watching a master. A young one, unfinished the way any 19-year-old is unfinished, but a master of this one thing already, past me at it. And the last of my certainty went out of me like breath and left me clean and quiet and strangely glad, the same gladness I'd seen in her face when she watched me shoot my 8. There is a piece on the far side of a broken pride. I found it at .6 behind a 19-year-old's rifle. Mark, I said. The mover ran. She led it. I watched her hold out ahead of it into the open bowl, the lead built off the range she'd already stolen from the empty track. And she broke 1 cold round, and the round and the target arrived at the same place at the same time, and the mover rang, center, running. First cold round. A hit not one of my students had made, that I had made only after years, that she made at 19 because she'd read the rail before the target ever showed. Second mover, I said, and my voice was steady now because the war in me was over and I was just a man watching a great shooter finish a great stage. Right rail, faster track on my mark. The second mover was the hardest target on the reach, a faster rail, a longer distance, the wind at the far end doing its worst. She read the empty rail again. She waited. Mark, I said, and it ran, and she tracked it and led it and broke 1 cold round into the open bowl ahead of it, and the fast far mover rang center, running cold first round. 8 targets, 8 cold first round hits, a perfect unknown distance cold bore stage, the same 848 I had shot to close the cadre and called the best of my life. She had matched it. And she had matched it from the worst point on the range. On the hidden angled plate, 2 of my men couldn't even find. On the far small plate, she'd centered cleaner than I had. And she had done it at 19 years old after 4 days of being called a kid and a mascot and beginner's luck by the very man now standing silent behind her rifle. She came up off the gun slow, the way she did everything, and she cleared it and set it on its bipod, and she looked back at us, the whole cadre, 6 senior snipers and me, standing in a loose silent arc behind .6 with nothing at all to say, and she waited. Not for applause. She didn't want applause. She waited the way she'd waited all week, for the rest of us to catch up to a thing she'd known since Monday. The silence on that line is the thing I'd take you to if I could take you anywhere in my life. It was total. The wind moved the flags and nobody moved anything else. Trell, who'd bet me she couldn't touch the 1200 steel all week, was looking at the ground. Devlin had his hand over his mouth. And I stood there and understood that I had just watched a 19-year-old outshoot every man on my line, because matching my clean stage from her point on her targets at her age wasn't matching, and every shooter standing there knew it. She had outshot us. She had outshot me. And she had done it without a single word thrown back at any of us, without one look that gloated, having taken the worst point I could give her and made it the place from which she'd correct the proudest man in the community. I was the one who broke the silence because it was mine to break. I walked up to point 6 and I crouched down beside her rifle, and I did the thing I should have done Monday morning. I asked to see her data book. "May I, Vance?" I said. "Not an order. I don't think I'd asked a third-class permission for anything in 15 years. She handed it to me, and I opened it and I read it, and the last of the story I'd been telling myself all week finally died on the page in her own neat hand. Distances I'd have called impossible, logged as routine. Conditions no range shooter ever sees, worked and solved and recorded across years, in a 19-year-old's book, which meant she'd started as a child and never stopped. And on an early page, a record I knew by reputation the way any long-gun man knew it, a national unknown distance cold bore record, the kind of number that gets talked about in the community without a name attached because the holder had never made noise about it, and beside it in her plain hand, a date and her initials, EV. I looked up at her. "You hold the cormorant record," I said. It came out almost a whisper. Every man on that line knew the cormorant number. None of us had ever met who shot it. "Yes, Senior Chief," she said, level. No pride in it and no false modesty either. Just the fact of herself, set down like the rifle case on Monday. "Around," I said, and something in my chest that had been clenched all week came loose, and it was almost a laugh, the helpless kind a man laughs at his own expense. "You told me you shot around. You didn't ask twice, Senior Chief." And that was the whole indictment, delivered without a trace of malice. I hadn't asked twice. I'd asked once, gotten a word I could sort into my category and stopped, because certainty doesn't ask twice. It sorts and moves on. She'd have told me. She'd have told me Monday if I'd walked down to point 6 and asked her like a person instead of filing her like a form. The information had been there the whole time, in her book, in her rifle, in her stillness. I just hadn't looked, because I already knew, and knowing is the enemy of seeing, and I'd have washed a cormorant record holder off my range as a mascot if the stage hadn't forced my hand. "Why are you really here, Vance?" I said, quiet, because I'd started to guess and I needed it said plain. She held my eyes. "To shoot the stage against your cadre, Senior Chief," she said, "so somebody could find out whether the package is still grade to standard, whether the line still shoots cold or just says it does." A small pause. "You do. Your cadre shot to standard today. You shot the best stage I've seen a cadre lead shoot. I'll be reporting that." The reason landed on me all at once, the worst point, the 4 days of silence, the patience. She hadn't been a student failing to earn respect. She'd been the standard, sent down among us disguised as the least of us, absorbing every laugh and every beginner's luck, because the grievance was never the point. The stage was the point. And the man who'd have thrown her off his range as a joke on Monday had, without knowing it, been the one being measured all week. I had passed, my cadre had shot to standard. She said so plainly, and I believed her. But I'd passed the shooting and failed the harder test, the one she hadn't been sent to give and gave me anyway, for free. The test of whether a man sure of what he knows can still look at what's in front of him. I stood up. My knees weren't young. And I did the last thing, the thing that cost the most and mattered most, and I did it in front of my whole cadre because that was where I'd done the disrespecting, and that was where the correcting belonged. "Petty Officer Vance," I said, and I put out my hand. "I called you a kid. I gave you the worst point on my range, and I logged your cold bore hits as luck in my own hand, and I was wrong on Monday and I stayed wrong through Wednesday, which is the part I'll answer for. You're the finest cold bore shooter I've ever stood behind. That includes me. I'd be honored to shake your hand." She looked at my hand a moment, and then she took it, and her grip was exactly what the rest of her was, sure, unhurried, no more force than the moment needed and no less. "Thank you, Senior Chief," she said. And then, because she was who she was, she gave me the tool back one more time, the way she'd handed me the 0 and the reversal on Wednesday. "For what it's worth," she said, "you shot 8 for 8 cold in an east wind. Most cadre leads I've graded couldn't." The looking again part. A small pause, the only almost smile I saw from her all week. "That's just reps, Senior Chief. Same as the rifle. You start unsure long enough to see the shooter before you file her. It comes with practice." That's just reps. She'd taken the hardest thing about being a man like me, the pride, the certainty, the whole load-bearing wall, and named it a skill you could train, the same as a wind call, the same as a cold bore hold. Something you get better at by choosing, over and over, to look before you know. She was 19 and she handed me that across the worst point on my range like it was obvious, like I'd surely known it longer than she'd been alive. And I hadn't, and I took it, and I have been working the rep ever since. We finished the package. She shot the rest of the week the way she'd shot the stage, and my cadre stopped being a cadre grading a student and became 6 good shooters trying to learn what the kid on point 6 knew. And she taught us, plainly, without lording anything, the reversal 0 and the empty rail range, and a dozen other things that had taken her a childhood of reps to own. Trell paid me the $20 he'd bet, and then he walked down to point 6 on his own and asked her to teach him the angled plate cosine hold. And she did, and that was Trell's version of the hand I'd offered, and she took it the same way. The truck came for her on the last morning, up the same access road, trailing the same pale dust. She loaded her duffel and her rifle case, low and easy, the weight already accounted for. She came to something like attention in front of me one last time. "Senior Chief," she said, "thank you for the .6. It was the honest place to shoot from." I've thought about that sentence more than any other from that week. The honest place to shoot from. I'd meant it as the worst point. A place to make a kid struggle, and she'd taken it as a compliment, because the worst point was the true test, and a shooter who wants to know what she really is chooses the true test over the fair one. She'd outshot my whole cadre from the honest place, and she was thanking me for it. "Vance," I said, "where do you go from here?" "Around," she said. And this time when she said it, there was that almost smile again, and I laughed out loud, an old man outwitted and grateful for it. And she climbed up into the truck and the door shut and the dust took her up the road and was gone. I run the packages still. I'm older now and slower on the bolt, and there are young shooters on my line who are better than I am, and I'm glad of it, which is a thing the Reuben Marsh of that Monday couldn't have said and meant. When a new shooter comes up the access road, whoever they are, whatever they look like, however the math runs, when I glance at them off the truck, I walk down to their point. I open their book. I ask them twice. And when the young ones roll their eyes at the old senior chief who won't just sort them and move on, I tell them about a 19-year-old who caught the 0 in a reversal on a cold first round and outshot my whole cadre from the worst point on the range, and who told me, with a rifle still warm on the bipod, that looking again is just reps. Then I put them on .6, the honest place to shoot from, and I stand behind them and I watch, really watch, and I try to see the shooter before I file her, and most days now I can. And on the days I can't, I remember that it's just reps, same as the rifle, and I get down behind the certainty one more time and work the shot again. Out at 1,200 yards, on a still morning, you can still hear it if you listen, the flat hard center note of steel taking a cold first round dead in the middle, the sound a fact makes when it finally gets through to a man who was sure. I hear it every time a young shooter rings the far plate. I heard it first from a kid I'd written off, on the worst point on my range in an east wind, and it is the truest thing I know now, truer than anything my certainty ever told me. The wind will lie to you all day long, and so will your own sureness, And the only cure for either one is to stop listening to what you already know and watch, cold and patient and humble, for the truth to cross zero, and then own it. She was 19. I called her a kid. She outshot every one of us, and she made me a better man on the way out the door, and she never raised her voice once. That's the whole story. I've told it now. Make of me what you will.